So I want to welcome the audience to the last panel of the 2020 Election Science Reform and Administration Virtual Conference. I know many of you have been with us for the last few days, and appreciate you staying with us and coming to the last panel. I want to thank the presenters. We have two papers this afternoon. Jesse Clark will present his work on the Maine event and the mismatch between expectations and outcomes. And Devin McCarthy will present his work on elite manipulation of democratic principles in the mass public. And I think you'll see that they've got a lot in common. That our discussant today is Thessalia Merivaki from Mississippi State. And Leah will give her comments on those papers. We'll give the authors a chance to respond to Leah's comments. If you've been with us over the last several days, same procedure. Ask your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. That'll open a dialog box. Please remember to address your question to the author or the person that you would like to answer your question. You can also use the chat button at the bottom of the screen. I'll try to monitor that as well. And the chat's useful if you just got a quick point that you want to make to one of the presenters. But you can ask a question there. It's a little easier for me to see what's going on in the Q&A session. So if you've got a good a question that you want to elaborate on, please use the Q&A button if you can. All audience members' video and microphones are disabled. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen right now and ask Jesse to kick it off with his presentation on the Maine event.
Perfect. All right. Like any good conference paper, it's not exactly what I proposed, but has some of the elements of it. So let me see if I can start sharing my screen. Oh, wrong one. Okay. Oh, sorry, everyone. Getting some. Perfect. All set? Perfect. Okay, so my name is Jesse Clark, and I am a incoming fifth-year PhD candidate in political science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And today I'll be presenting one of my dissertation papers, Electoral System Change in the United States. It's a little bit different than what I initially proposed, which is just focused on Maine. It's more taking in the entire system of electoral system change and testing it with a few Maine cases. Okay, so I'm not going to bore you with too much literature and background, but where I'm situating this paper is in the literature on democratization, but specifically electoral systems. And as we know, electoral systems are they're a set of rules for taking votes in any given sort of election and allocating seats, whether that's in a representative body or an elected institution or even an executive branch. So that's what an electoral system is. It's just taking seats to votes, right? A subset of this literature where I hope to situate this piece is in electoral system change, and that's changing from one system to another. That can happen within a democracy like New Zealand, or it can happen in a larger transition from, say, communism to a democratic system. We see that in a lot of the post-USSR states. But one problem with this is that it's poorly defined. Renwick talks about this in some of his work. Generally speaking, though, it means to go from PR to plurality, but there are also other types of reforms as well that Jacobs and Lannemar talk about. If you could take what I'm situating here in their framework, it'd be somewhere between major reform and minor reform, but I don't completely prescribe to that in the paper. So I want to talk about the American electoral system, the American electoral system since 1788 specifically. Largely speaking, it's been constant. Single magnitude districts with plurality voting, first past the post. There's been some difference with that with multi-member districts here and there, but that's generally illegal these days. It's been considered one of the most rigid two-party systems in the world based on just, it hasn't really changed since then. Other than like the primary structure has changed a lot. since there's been no major swing between plurality and first past the post or to a parliamentary system, it hasn't really fit well in the electoral system change literature or the electoral system literature, especially when there are other places to compare to with much greater change. However, I argue that this really isn't the correct view of how the American political system has changed since 1788. I argue that it's many smaller changes. These changes are first the who. We start in 1788 with white landowning men, and nowadays that's completely different. The how. You start in non-anonymous voting books, putting your name down, then you go to party printed ballots, the Australian ballot, now you have issues around apportionment, postal voting, that kind of thing. So you have these changes in the how. And then also the restrictions, like I said before, not only who in terms of restrictions, but also what you have. Landowning, literacy, registration status, voter ID. So you really have these three major categories of changes to the American electoral system. I argue in the paper that these are cases of what I dub incremental electoral system change. And in this paper, I present a theory to explain how and why this happens in the American context, especially in the modern era. So an increment in this system, IESC, I also would love some feedback on that as well. An increment is any change to the who can vote, how they can vote, and any restrictions leading up to that. Increments can be positive or negative, right? So say Wisconsin instituted voter ID. That is an increment. You added a barrier to voting. If the Democrats later on add a different way of voting, if they take away that voter ID, that's another increment. You're taking it away, or you can take away a registration restriction. That would also be considered. I argue that these increments add up over the years to cause fundamental shifts in the electoral system, the electoral environment, that essentially approximate a whole electoral system change, but doesn't fit in our understanding. Recent examples of IESC in the American political system, of course, you have ranked choice voting in Maine, which a lot of the cases here focus on, or a lot of my empirical analysis focuses on. All mail elections, which is a really hot button item this summer, leading into November, ADR, voter ID, and some recent Supreme Court decisions like Shelby. You could argue that is also, those are also increments. So why not reform? I know a lot of people in the audience, including myself, have written on electoral reforms. And why am I kind of abandoning that? Well, I'm not. I'm trying to have a friendly amendment to this literature. I argue that we shouldn't use reform to talk about the electoral system for two reasons. So first, it's mostly empirical and it focuses on single reforms. Most of the works in this literature are one-off analyses. They have extreme value added. I don't want to downplay that. We've learned a lot of, say, the impact of felon restrictions, the impact of motor voter, the impact of women's suffrage on voting. So these are very important pieces, but I want to situate them and ground them in theory. Also, there's normative baggage that comes with the word reform. Reform, by definition, is a good thing. There can be bad reforms, of course, but reform has a normative connotation to it that I want to strip away when we look at these, because even reforms meant to boost democratic principles, say postal voting, Berinsky found that, yes, it does increase some turnout, but it warps the electorate. So a lot of these reforms have a mixed bag. So that's why I want to really kind of move us away from that kind of language. So now I'll start my theory. So I want to start off with some theoretical assumptions, and these aren't particularly strong. Elites are primarily electorally motivated. Mayhew wrote about this, Cox has written about this, Crono's written about this. Generally speaking, the general public acquires most of their political beliefs from parties and elite discourse. This situates me firmly in behavioralism, which may not be the most popular thing in the electoral system change literature, but I think it has some pretty strong empirical grounding. Finally, the average voter suffers from poor attribution. One of the papers on the panel probably discusses this pretty strongly. Domenech-Kisner talks about this, and also the Aiken-Bartels pieces talk about this as well. They have a very hard time looking at cause and effect, especially things that are complex like electoral systems. Arnold talks about this with the setting of Congress. I'm more talking about it in electoral systems and voting. So now we'll jump right into the theory, just so I get enough time to talk about the empirical analysis that I did. So the theory plays as follows. So first, a proposal is raised by party activists and brought to the attention of elites. I don't say how the proposal is brought to the partisan activists. There are many different ways of doing that. That could be its own fruitful line of study in terms of electoral system change. But I argue that these elites will mistrust the motives of out-party activists. Say the Heritage Center goes to Nancy Pelosi and argues for voter ID. Her office is probably going to think that the Heritage Foundation just wants to win. And conversely, when an in-party activist comes to you and argues for a change, you're probably going to think that it's positive, or at least it will help you. You're going to trust them more. Second, elites decide whether they're going to benefit from it or not, and then they signal their support of their opposition. It's really good because X, it's really bad because it'll warp democracy and stop people from voting, that kind of thing. They'll make these very public arguments and they're very loud about them. Because all being said, it could influence whether they and their party stay in power. So they're going to be very vocal. Next, the general public, they're going to observe these cues. This is a very Zoller type model. The general public are going to observe these cues and they're going to tend to adopt the opinions of their in-partisans. This is generally a two-party framework I'm presenting. And in the Q&A, if you'd like, I can discuss how this would work in a single-party setting, like as we saw in Maine with ranked choice voting play out in the initial 2016 ballot. Say it gets through all of these steps and doesn't fail and gets implemented. It's going to be used by the voters, and then elites will reevaluate their support, and it will restart the loop from the elites. It'll cut out the activists generally, but it'll restart the loop. And this will keep playing until it's not salient anymore. So here's a graphical version of that, where it comes to the elites and it creates this feedback loop. And we're seeing this play out in Maine, specifically with, this is the third time ranked choice voting will be potentially on the ballot. The Republicans are in this process of gathering signatures. Whether they will because of COVID is to be determined, but they're trying to go third time around. So we do see this loop in the wild, so to speak. So the first hypothesis is that elites are going to have differential motive. They're going to perceive differential motives, like I said. They're going to form opinions around IESC based on their beliefs of their partisan implications for the change. If you think it's going to help you, you're probably going to support it. If you think it's not, you know. Next, the mass public, they're going to see cues from these elites and form their opinions based on them largely. Or in an in-party setting, the elite that's closest to them. Next, the impact of democratic norms, which are generally the vehicle for argument around electoral system change, they're going to actually just be contingent upon elite cues. So when in-party cues, when it's just in-party, they're important. If there's elite conflict between the parties, they're not going to be important at all, I argue. That goes against some current work that's about to come out in the AJPS around this. So did the test, this is where Maine comes in. So I had to use a multi-method approach because you can't randomize most of these things. So I had to really test each step individually. I did to test the impact of elites, elite updating, and how they're making up their minds. I did a survey and qualitative interviews of Maine elites. That's legislators, lobbyists, think tank operatives in Maine. That's still ongoing. I did a national survey experiment on Democratic values with in-partisan, another one when I randomized conflicting partisan cues, and then finally a survey of Maine voters following the implementation of RCV, which have some fascinating results for that. Okay, so the survey of Maine elites, that is probably the most difficult part of this study. And I wanted to really see how they decide how to support the reforms, how they update after. And from my own qualitative knowledge of working in Maine politics, as well as various sources, I created a universe, and I've been sampling. I was sampling in person, but pandemic. So I've moved to phone and online sampling, which seems to be working well. The first national survey experiment, like I said, is looking at internet voting. I'll talk about why that's okay to do because it's actually not a particularly salient issue. And I'm looking at how respondents react to reading a simulated newspaper article where I randomize an expert who's a co-partisan, generally a Harvard professor, an election expert, who's of their party. And then I randomize whether it's going to cause them to win or lose. Next, I look at a similar setup where I randomize in-party and out-party, which are always the opposite in this framework, in-party and out-party cues, along with experts who are relaying the democratic norms, kind of the referees, if you will. And I also use internet voting as well. Finally, a lot of steps here. I did a survey of Maine, an experiment of Maine voters using Dynata. I weighted it myself using crosstabs on gender, race, and education, kind of actually the interaction of those, so I'm not doing independent tabs. And then I did a priming experiment which is similar to experiment 2, just to see if that actually works around a similar case election with incremental electoral system reform. Then I also added public opinion questions around people's experiences, especially sociotropic and egotropic confidence, which I'll talk about more. So here's why internet voting's okay. It really only spikes, interest in it really only spikes around elections. 2004 was actually a huge spike. Interestingly, if you look at your left, that's the beginning of June, not much spike around COVID. So that would be interesting for somebody to look into. But these are Google Trends, and this is generally a good way of looking at how salient an issue is. So the elite survey, I only have a sample of about 65 to 70 people right now. But I'm able to put together some qualitative evidence, which I present in the paper. And I found that there's a fundamental, some of my hypothesis, that there's a fundamental mistrust of out-of-party activists. Republicans are extremely opposed to, say, fair vote. They're extremely opposed to ranked choice voting in Maine, and some of those groups that were pushing for ranked choice voting in Maine. Democrats, they generally think they just want to make elections better, which is interesting, especially when you randomize that, you still get the same answers. Quantitative, it's too early to tell. I tossed in 2 experiments with that. I don't have a big enough sample to even analyze those yet. And I don't want to bind myself quite yet. The first national survey experiments, some of my hypothesis, I find that both democratic principles and partisanship are highly significant, almost exactly the same point values and impact. And there's really no difference between democratic principles and partisan cues when there's no partisan conflict. Here's when you go from the sample of the probability of selecting. One is in favor, one is opposed, 4 is in favor in this setup. When you go from it will help the party and it will help democracy to it'll help the party and hurt democracy, it lowers support significantly. This is just an ordinal logit model, just to really show you the impact, visually speaking. And then this is when you go from it will help democracy and it will help the party to it'll just help democracy. You take away that partisan cue, there's no impact. So people aren't parsing those out particularly. Next, the experiment, when I looked at conflicting partisan cues, you throw in Democrats and Republicans arguing about internet voting. Democratic principles play essentially no role in opinion formation. They almost have no impact that's measurable. And the interaction between the two is not significant, interestingly enough. Democratic principles are only significant at the 10% p-value. Partisan cues, of course, are highly significant, no matter model specification or controls. The Maine experiments, I found the same thing. I need to throw in the coefficients for expert support and partisan support. Sorry for that slide. But as we see expert support, and which they are relaying democratic values, they're nonpartisan setup, it's just noise, there's no impact. And then partisan support is highly significant. And that's robust to controls as well, even though this is estimating the ATE of an experiment. So the Maine survey, this is where I tested the loop, kind of that feedback loop I was saying after implementation of incremental electoral system change. So there's strong observational evidence of elite-led updating. And I get that from, as I'm about to show you in a second, the sociotropic and egotropic confidence in the result of the first use of ranked choice voting. But the issue I'm running into with this, and maybe I'll have to run an experiment on something similar like internet voting, I can't rule out rational considerations just because of the way it happened in Maine in 2018 with Jared Golden probably or maybe winning a congressional seat because of ranked choice voting. So if we look at it from a rational actor's perspective, of course, the Republicans are going to be vehemently opposed to it afterwards. So those are observationally equivalent at this point. I need to parse those out. Here's when we look at voter confidence. Republicans and Democrats are completely different. Egotropic confidence is my ballot was counted properly. Sociotropic, where our ballots in general are counted properly in the race. And as we see, Democrats and Republicans are just polar opposites on these. And the ratio is that when we compare this to the survey of the performance of American elections in the 2016 race, these ratios are not only opposite. Democrats actually had a little bit lower, they had a lower voter confidence, egotropic and sociotropic than Republicans. The ratios are way off. And also, this is much, much stronger than can be explained by the winner's effect, as has been identified by Sanchez and Stewart back in 2015. So we're seeing something that's much, much stronger than the winner's effect and is actually flipped from 2016. And that's why I argue in the paper that this is likely due to elite discourse, but I need to probably experimentally parse that apart or find a different way to leverage that. So in conclusion, in this paper, I defined a new way of looking at changes to the American electoral system, especially in the modern age. And I've presented a new theory to explain how it happens and why it happens. And then I tested it using a multi-method approach, which is ongoing, so I value your feedback. So speaking of feedback, the theory, of course, is still in development. I'm hoping to have a different iteration of this for APSA. And then empirics, I need a better way to measure the loop. So I'm going to do a FOA request of legislative emails. That's in the works, but potentially some experiments as well. So thanks again, and I look forward to your feedback.
All right, great. Thank you, Jesse. And our next paper will be presented by Devin McCarthy. I've been really impressed on all the panels that I've moderated this week. Everybody's been on time, so great job.
All right, hello. We got my screen share working. All right, so my name is Devin McCarthy. I recently completed my PhD at Duke University, and I'll be starting a postdoc at the University of Oklahoma in the fall. And my paper is called Elite Manipulation of Democratic Principles in the Mass Public. And I'm really zeroing in on one aspect of the process of electoral system change, election reform. And that's the question of whether elites are, party elites are able to affect the democratic principles that the public holds as a way to increase support for their preferred election rule changes. So can the public constrain elite attempts at electoral manipulation? We know that elites regularly change election rules to benefit their own parties. And we know that the public is sometimes driven in their opinions by pretty much pure partisan interest. They also want election rules that benefit their parties, but also there's good reason to think that the public does care about fairness in electoral systems, that perhaps partisanship is not the only thing that matters. And so if party elites want to propose an election reform that the public thinks is unfair, that might be a problem for them. If the public perceives what the elites are doing as manipulation, as not real democracy, then they could potentially impose costs in terms of costs in elections or protests or all sorts of things that elites might want to avoid. So in that situation, let's say the elites still want to implement this reform that maybe the public isn't totally on board with. They might use cues to try and shift opinion on the reform, and in particular to try and change how people are thinking about what is fair and what democratic principles they care about. We know from all sorts of research, Zoller, Lenz, that elite cues do significantly affect the public's policy positions. And we also know that values, that your core political values tend to be a little more stable than policy positions and maybe harder to manipulate. So elites can change public opinion on individual policies pretty easily, but on people's core political values, that's a little bit harder for them to change. So in this paper, when I'm talking about democratic principles or values, I'm kind of using these words interchangeably. A lot of recent research on democratic principles has focused on the idea that people either have democratic principles and care about them, or they don't. So either you're the kind of person that cares about liberal democracy, or you're not. And in this paper, I take a slightly different approach to just say there are many different principles that different beliefs that one could have about the way democracy should be run, about what is fair. And they're often in conflict with each other. And so I'm not going to make, in this paper, normative judgments about which beliefs about democracy are more democratic. Instead, even though some of them, there's a reasonable case to be made that some of these beliefs are not particularly democratic and how we usually think about it. But instead, I'm just going to look at, can elites change how people think about democratic principles, which principles they prioritize, and which principles they are likely to associate with certain electoral reform. So part of the inspiration for this project was looking at this op-ed that Mitch McConnell wrote in the Washington Post. Mitch McConnell saw that the Democrats were considering an election reform bill in the House, and he decided that he wanted to write an op-ed in the Washington Post to convince people that this was bad. And he used a couple different tactics in this op-ed. First of all, he called it "Behold the Democrat Political Protection Act." So the main argument here is the Democrats are just doing this for partisan interest, and that's bad. And then he also goes point by point and argues against the reforms in the bill, including, for instance, the idea of making Election Day a federal holiday. And he does not just say we shouldn't make Election Day a federal holiday because that would be bad for Republicans. He tries to justify this using a value, and the value is that we shouldn't be giving bureaucrats 6 additional days of paid vacation. This is unreasonable. And so my question from this is: so does this strategy work? Is it important that McConnell add this principled justification to his opposition to making Election Day a holiday? And also, is it effective that he is framing this policy as something that Democrats are just doing to benefit themselves? So in this paper, I basically test 2 mechanisms of ways in which elites could manipulate values. One of them is directly changing democratic values. This would just be elites convincing people to care more about certain values or principles, let's say election integrity, relative to another one, like voter access. So that would be the most direct approach. A somewhat less direct approach would be to change the values that people associate with a particular policy. So let's say party elites have a certain rule change they want to do, and they don't think that the public associate the principles that they care about with that policy, so they could try and make an argument, like Mitch McConnell did for making election day a holiday, of a new principle that people could associate with that. And if there's not a particularly applicable one, they might even try and use a principle that is not applicable. Maybe it doesn't matter whether the principle they use actually directly relates to the policy. It's people just want to see some sort of normative, bare minimum of normative justification for policy. And finally, it's possible that maybe all these values and principles are not necessary, and just partisan interest is enough. All elites would have to do is say, this law helps our party, so you should support it if you care about our party. So I'm going to test each of these three in turn. First, I test the idea of manipulating value correspondence. So this is an experiment. People are asked about either vote by mail or making election day a holiday. And particularly pay attention to treatment groups 3 through 5. So this is where Republican leaders are giving a message about the policy. Group 3 is, the message is just the title of McConnell's op-ed. Democrats are doing this just to benefit their own party in elections. Groups 4 and 5 justify the policy, justify opposition to the policy using one of two values. In one case, the value actually relates to the policy. So if you are assigned to making election day a holiday and you get the value of extra taxpayer-funded vacation time for bureaucrats, well, that's what McConnell picked. That's the value that he thinks actually relates to that. There's a possibility that you'll get a value that doesn't relate to that. So you could say, you could see Republican leaders opposing the policy in Group 5 of making election day a holiday because it would increase voter fraud, which perhaps you could come up with a reason why that makes sense, but I think that's an inapplicable justification. So I test whether these justifications have an effect on support for these policies. And in 3 of these 4 cases, the only exception being the top left case, Republican respondents on support for vote by mail. In all the other cases, you see that the treatments do have some substantial effects. But it's less clear that the particular value used by elites makes any difference at all. So you can see that the estimates for the effect of elites using the election day holiday value on making election day a holiday in the bottom, in the right side, is pretty much exactly the same as the effect of using this voter fraud value on making election day a holiday. So elites are moving opinion here, and it doesn't really matter the justification that they use. And also it's worth noting that in all 3 of those cases where there's an effect, the most effective message for Republican elites is the idea that Democrats are just doing this to benefit themselves. And even for Democrats, that increases support for both policies quite a bit. So elites are able to affect policy opinions relatively easily. It doesn't matter what value justification they use to do that. So one possible follow-up question is, do they need the values at all? Perhaps elites could just talk about why they say that the policies are going to benefit their party, and that's the only reason to do it. So I ran an experiment to test this based on recent scenarios we've seen where elites, party elites basically get caught admitting that their election reforms are in fact motivated by partisanship. There's a famous case in 2012 where the House leader in Pennsylvania said, voter ID is going to allow Governor Romney to win the state of Pennsylvania, and we got that done. That was an achievement for the Republicans. And there's some controversy over this, but perhaps voters don't care. Perhaps Republicans are thrilled to hear that. So that's what I test in this study. I asked people about both voter ID and automatic voter registration, and they see, respondents see actually both treatments here. Both question 1 and question 2. And the other thing I randomize, if they get the treatment, is which order they see these in. So everyone is told that a Democrat and a Republican have been caught saying this law was passed for partisan benefit. And you can see that these treatments across the board had negative effects on opinion. These effects are on support for the policies. These effects are particularly strong for out-partisans. So Democrats hearing that a Republican got caught saying this thing about voter ID laws being partisan interest, that significantly decreases support for voter ID among Democrats by quite a bit. But even among like partisans, even among Republicans who hear this, it's not always significant, but we do see some decrease in support based on hearing that your own party supported a law for the purposes of partisan self-interest. So I think that's pretty interesting. I mean, this is kind of a bare minimum test to see that people care about fairness, but clearly partisanship still does matter because this has a bigger effect for out-partisans than in-partisans, but it does show that people are not purely partisan. They're not willing to just go along with party elites who say, I passed this law to benefit the party. So the last test is, can elites directly affect the principles that people care about? And in this study, people see one of 3 Republican messages about what you should care about when it comes to election reform, and one of 3 Democratic messages. And it's randomized within each party which one you see. There's a moderate message, a strong message, and an extreme message for each party. The moderate message is going to be something like, for Republicans, you care about election integrity. For Democrats, we should expand access to the ballot box. The extreme ones, for the Republicans, it would be that only citizens who can speak and read English should be able to vote. And for Democrats, it would be expanding voting rights to all U.S. permanent residents, including non-citizens and people in prison for felonies. So this is a very expansionist idea of what a democracy should be. That's one possible principle you could have about democracy. And on the Republican side, it's a very restrictive idea of what democracy, and racist idea of what democracy should be. So I first just looked at which principles people prioritize. So I asked people basically to rank order these 6 principles that correspond to the messages in the experimental treatment. And it's about as expected. Most people prioritize the moderate messages, voter access, voter fraud, and then the extreme messages the extreme principles are not super popular. So not that many people are endorsing universal voting for all U.S. permanent residents, or only English speaking people can vote. So I test the effects of elites endorsing these principles on the degree to which people are likely to prioritize these principles, rank these principles at the top of their list. And I do not see a lot of effects. Mostly, for the most part, elites are not able to affect the degree to which citizens prioritize certain principles over others. And that includes the extreme principles. So you can, this is the Democrats, and on this slide, you see the Republicans. So there's maybe a couple indications, especially on the English-only voting, that maybe the Republican message is having a bit of an effect, but it's not statistically significant in any of these cases. So in a sense, that is it shows some limitations of what elites can achieve. It's not easy to convince your partisans just through cues that they should think about democracy and what they care about in democracy in a different way than they used to. So some mixed conclusions for this study. We see that partisan elites can manipulate public opinion on election policy issues, especially, and I think the election policy issues I picked are relatively low salience. And the effectiveness of their cues does not depend on whether their values that they justify their policies with actually correspond to policies. But we also see that in study 2, purely partisan elite cues are not effective. So fairness does motivate opinion to a certain degree. And we also see that elites are not able to directly affect the democratic values and principles that people care about. And of particular importance, I think, particular interest, that elites are not able to push people toward more extreme values than they already had, at least in this kind of short-term survey experiment. So I think the big question that remains after this is, even if there are some limitations on the degree to which elites can move opinion, will voters actually impose costs on elites if they violate these principles in a way that voters consider unfair? That is not something I can test in the study, and I think is a pretty important question. The public does care about fairness, but how much does it really care when it comes to practical action? All right, thank you all. Thank you to ESRA for giving me the opportunity to present, and thank you all for listening.
All right, thank you very much, Devin. If you'll stop sharing your screen, that'd be great. Just a reminder to the audience, if you have questions for either of our presenters, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. Our discussant today is Thessalia Merivaki, who has starred in several of our panels this week. So we're happy to have Leah back with us for one last panel. Take it away, Leah.
Thank you both. Thanks, Michael, and thank you both, Devin and Jesse, for your presentations and for sharing your papers with me. So what I will do, I will send you more detailed comments on your papers, but today I want to go over some general comments for both of you, and then I will start with ESRA and with Jesse, and then I will go with Devin's paper. All right. So both, I have some comments that I think apply to both of your papers, because you have common themes. So you talk about how elite positions on election reform affect public attitudes and what are the dynamics behind that in opposing or supporting election reform. And you both seem to be drawing from democratic theory to frame your papers, especially the term democratic principles. So in both of your papers, you use the term principles a lot, and Devin, you mentioned that you use values and principles interchangeably, but you do not really define what principles are, right? So you imply that it's about fairness, right? And this term is used a lot, but democratic principles can mean a lot of different things, and maybe we have not done a good job in defining them in the literature, but you need to call that out, right? So don't assume that when we're talking about principles that we know we all have a good understanding of what they mean, especially when you want to test them empirically. So this is my first point that I think applies to both of your papers. And you're doing a great job in trying to flesh out your theory and to test it with your experiments. But I think what is missing at this point, and you brought that in your presentation, is context, right? So Devin, you talked about the McConnell op-ed. This should be up front in your paper to give more flavor to your story, right? Why is it so important? And Jesse, you mentioned something specific in the Maine election in 2018. So these are contextual factors that I think will bring a little bit more depth to your story, other than talking about a theory. So bring that in up from the start to make just your story flow a little bit better. And especially because election reforms are controversial, we cannot avoid that, right? And they are partisan. So we have to be able to talk about how they are applied in current events, right? And why we draw from those events to start asking those questions. Okay, and the third point that again applies to both of your papers, you talk a lot about, you know, democratization and democratic theory, election system change. So you draw a lot about, you know, from the comparative literature, which is great, but I think there's a lot of literature missing that you could be bringing in, especially when we talk about partisanship and why election reforms are adopted. There's a ton of literature, you know, voter ID, early voting, and Jesse, I don't know if Charles Stewart is your advisor, but I saw that you're citing him in your paper, but there are a lot of other scholars that have been writing, Pippa Norris on the global perspective, but a lot of good papers that try to flesh out this relationship between the adoption of state election laws and you know, perception of fairness and accuracy and all these things. So I think that you could bring that a little bit more in both of your papers. So that literature, other than the public opinion literature, the state election reforms literature as well. So let me know if I'm going too fast. Dan Smith always tells me, Leah, you're speaking too fast. So I'm going to start with Jesse. And so you're asking, reading through your paper, and I think your presentation really answered a lot of my questions that I have. So your question is, what essentially drives support or opposition for changing election rules, right? And is it partisanship, democratic principles, or both or neither, right? So, and I like the frame that you're trying to use that we might, from the global perspective, we study election changes in a very static manner, and especially when we talk about majority voting and single member districts. But in the context of the United States, we have seen these changes in who, when, and how, right? Who can vote when and how. So there are all these changes, and you, after seeing your presentation, I understand the term increment a little bit better, because in my mind it was like, well, incremental means it takes time, right? And then some changes are immediate. So how can we apply? So it was very hard for me to understand the theory of IESC, but you did a better job explaining it in your presentation that at least I was able to understand it in the paper. Okay, so you talk about how that some reforms are meant to promote participation and maintain democratic principles, but not all reforms are created equal, right? I think this is a very important point, and you have to flesh that out a little bit better, because it is true, right? And then you argue that your incremental election system change framework, that there are dynamics in how elites are pressured, right, by interest groups to take positions on changing rules, and then how they find support, how they actually implement the rules, and then how the public evaluates that change, and when that policy is adopted. But from your internet voting experiment, I get the understanding that the theory might be applied to how voters, based on an experience with a specific reform, might be supporting future reforms, right? And that is not, at least in the paper that you submitted for my revision, I do not see that connection. And I think it's very fascinating, at least when I was reading it, right? So RCV was implemented in Maine, right? Your experiment was also asking about internet voting, which is a hypothetical. So how could experiences with RCV, which is a fairly complex reform, right? How does that affect public support for internet voting, right? I thought that, from my reading of the paper, that was a very fascinating dynamic that perhaps could help you, flesh out your theory a little bit better. So, okay, so let's see. All right, I like that you attempt to redefine the term reform, because you're right, we use it a lot. We use, election reform and election change a lot, but maybe there's more to the term that we realize. So I really commend you for trying to take a stab at it. Okay, that's why I think context is important in this example, right? All right, so a few of my concerns that I think that I recommend you to consider is your IEC framework, right? So from what I understand, this is part of your dissertation, this is it appears that it's a very complex procedure, right? And a process that I think trying to fit the theory, explaining a theory and testing it into different contexts is too much for one paper. That is a little bit problematic, because in your attempt to show the mechanism in your experiments, you have less space to elaborate the exact mechanism that IESC works. So that is missing a lot from the paper. And you did a better job explaining it in the presentation, but you cannot fit everything in one single paper. So I think that's a limitation. If that paper is meant to be submitted to a journal, I think that's a big challenge for you to overcome. So you have to think about how you want to, restructure it. But because for a theoretical chapter, this is great. This is a great, framework to use and elaborate more on how we understand change in the U.S. context. Okay. All right. Because the theory seems to be more of an institutional theory, right? But then when you use it to apply it with public opinion, then it gets a little bit muddy. So I think you need more space to be able to expand on your theory more and flesh out how it works from an institutional perspective and connect it to public opinion and mass, how elites affect public attitudes, okay? Okay, I think I talked about internet voting and the incremental, so the idea of an incremental policy change, is it over time? Is it incremental in that we add a reform and then we add another reform? Because I think you mentioned that changes that happen in increments, right? But are those increments in terms of time, or we adopt a reform so we make registration easier and then we add voting by mail, so we make voting easier too? Is that the increment you're discussing, or is it how fast or how late it takes a state or the federal government to adopt policy? So that's something that was a question that I had when I was reading the theoretical, your theory. All right, I talked about context. Both of you stated your question earlier. So both of you stated your question about on page 6 or 7. I think it's, it makes sense to prime the reader earlier on what your specific research question is, because Jesse, reading your paper, I thought it was about institutions, right? And then the question was about elite attitudes. And I think changing the title in your presentation makes me understand better what the paper is about, but the version that I read had a different title, so it was a little bit confusing what I was expecting, compared to what you're doing. Okay, let's see. And partisanship, right? Again, especially in the literature, parties are important. So bring more of the partisan components, other than talking about just party elites, bring more of the partisan consideration up front and make that part of your story, because we know that voters have attitudes and partisanship affects it, right? So bring that more into your paper. All right, I'm gonna switch to Devin's paper, and you have a very similar question, right? How do party elites position themselves on election reforms to influence public support or opposition? And your theory is that elites often rely on principles or values, you can use the term interchangeably, of election fairness to support a reform, and they refrain from using terms that blatantly say that we want to win elections, right? But sometimes they do, so you want to see whether voters catch on those cues and how that affects their opinions. So you start one term that I think that you should reconsider using. The word manipulation is very catchy, and there is evidence that party elites and parties, they do change the rules or manipulate them for benefit. But you are using the term in two different contexts in this paper. You're using it to refer to changes in rules, manipulating rules, but also manipulating or framing, right? So I think that's a little bit confusing. So if you use the term manipulation to talk about how elites are framing issues, then clarify that, because at some points it becomes a little bit confusing what type of manipulation you're referring to. And I would argue that it's a little bit charging. So maybe using, framing or priming, maybe that's, framing, I think, maybe a more neutral term to use. I agree with your argument that there are more than one principles or values related to democracy. I'm not convinced that that they're often conflicting. And I'm thinking about access versus integrity that you mentioned in the paper. You mentioned it further down after you have talked a lot about principles, but not really defined them. And I'm not sure, and because they have been so partisan, right? Democrats usually talk about access and Republicans talk about integrity. I don't really think that they're conflicting, right? Because an electoral system should maintain integrity and also, ensure access, although oftentimes those are trade-offs, but they're not necessarily conflicting. So you talk about negative principles, and you talk about these conflicting principles, but you don't really give examples in what way they are conflicting, right? And I think that's very important, especially when you test, the idea that only English speakers should vote or only informed citizens have to vote. So are those democratic principles? And if they are, who says, right? So clarify, again, define what democratic principles are, especially when you want to test them empirically. I like that you took a stab on a federal law, because when we talk about election reform in the literature, we often talk about state election policies. So you talk about a federal HR1 that had AVR, vote by mail, and making election day a holiday. So that's an interesting approach to think about, okay, how do elites at the national level frame and whether voters pick up on this cue. So I really like that approach. I wonder whether there are any effects, at least in the voter's mind, that are driven by state dynamics, because these policies have been discussed and some of them are used by states, right? And the state legislators are making similar comments. So I wonder whether there's any, the distrust or lack of, consistent findings maybe is driven by other factors other than, how party elites at the national level are framing. And also, I'm wondering whether there are other reasons to the reactions you're seeing. Are there responses to a federal and national election reform, or the reform in itself, which can be implemented at the state level? And the reason I'm saying that is because, there are always reasons to object to national federal intervention in elections, because, states constitutionally are running elections, right? We experienced similar problems when Congress wanted to adopt the National Voter Registration Act, the Voting Rights Act, right? So and you mentioned it yourself, what exactly is driving, this attitude? Is it the queue itself, or other dynamics that we might not be considering? I'm not sure if I mentioned that before. I think I did. The distinction between positive and negative principles. So you seem to be implying that the voter fraud framework is a negative principle, or that's the way I understood it. So I think you need to clarify what you mean by negative and positive principles, especially in the context of democratic values. And you also you had it in your presentation as well, that values are more stable than policy positions. But then you argue that depending on how elites are framing them, that voters can change which value they use to evaluate. So I think that's a little bit of a contradiction, right? Or you want to challenge that theory. I think maybe that's something that you need to flesh out a little bit better. And one of the things that you mentioned in the paper is that you wanted to try a principle that is irrelevant to democratic theory. And if my understanding is that the argument that making election day a holiday would cost taxpayers money, is that what you consider an irrelevant principle, right? That doesn't have to do with democratic principles. That was a little difficult to understand, what is the irrelevance of that argument. So clarify that a little bit more. And I think that I don't know if I talked about it, I did the same thing with Jesse, but I will tell you again, remind me to get back to it, but this is how I would frame your work, Devin, because there are a lot of cool things in there. So I would argue that states have been expanding access to voting, from voter registration to vote by mail, and some adopt policies to make voting easier even on election day, right? But when it comes to talking about a federal policy, how do national elites position themselves to justify support or opposition? Which frames do they use, and how voters receive them? And I think that your framework of necessary and or sufficient conditions that you mentioned in your presentation, I think it's very useful to think about what is it more of, how loyal, if we want to use that term, voters are to their principles, right? And how conflicted are they when they get these messages from elites? So I think using that frame, starting from the election reform at the state level to apply it in how we understand reform at the national level, I think that could be a useful frame for this paper. And Jesse, I'm not sure if I said, yeah, so I don't know if I skipped it, but for your paper, I was thinking a good frame would be, how do we understand why reforms happen, right? And which factors are driving it? But that would require thinking about a lot of literature on the adoption of election reforms, right? And there's a lot of research out there, and a common finding is partisanship, right? But I think you can use the internet voting experiment to show how experience with RCV can affect voters' attitudes for a reform that has not been implemented or discussed extensively, right? So how could an experience with something right now might affect future, support for future reforms? And maybe that can give an example of that incremental, theoretical framework that you're posing. So I hope I didn't speak too much, and I'll send you all my feedback. I really enjoyed reading your papers, and thank you for sending them to me. So I'm going to leave it for Q&A and your responses as well.
Okay, great. Yeah, so a little time for responses. I did want to let the presenters know there are, the audience has been good about submitting questions, so I want to make sure we have time to get to those too. But Jesse, if you have any comments on Leah's comments, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for those. Those are incredibly helpful comments. Like I said, this is a pretty early draft. And as you can see with the presentation and also the paper, I am juggling a lot of very big questions that I don't have the amount of bandwidth to answer in a single paper. So potentially one of the ways I can do that is to break off IESC from the Maine analysis, or from the analysis of the partisanship, which you may see in future iterations of this. Another thing that came up a few times in both Leah's feedback and also in the Q&A is how this works over history. So I really liked that comment you had at the very end to really parse out why it happens once as opposed to the historical moving back. Perhaps that it's its own set of analyses that don't really belong in what I'm saying, because I don't address those at all. I kind of postulate that it's there, but I don't test it, which would be absolutely necessary to really make the claim I'm making. And yes, I do agree. I need to really, I address the literature on electoral system change, which is kind of America doesn't do anything, but I will admit I have left out a lot of the reform literature and a lot of pieces from some of the very accomplished authors in this virtual room, which will be as well in future iterations. I think that can really help me refine what I'm saying as well. So thank you for those. In terms of the internet voting, I do need to justify that a little more as well. I was playing around before with some comparisons to other reforms, and when you compare Google Trends, which isn't a perfect measure, but you compare it to vote by mail, it's essentially on zero, where vote by mail does kind of these things above it. So it does still appear to be the right way to go with that, I think. So I didn't waste too much money on experiments, hopefully. What else? Yeah, so thanks for that, and I'll attempt to answer the questions on the sidebar as well. This is all very, very awesome feedback, and thank you so much. I will definitely be using this in future iterations.
Great, thanks, Jesse. Devin, do you have any comments?
Yeah, so thank you so much. Those were great comments, great feedback. In the big picture sense, I definitely agree that one of my biggest challenges in this paper is really to define what I mean by democratic principles, because, as you said, I think the literature has not really reached a consensus on what that means. What does it mean for people to care about some principle or value relating to democracy and apply that to their opinions about election reforms? I need to nail down exactly what that means. In terms of the, I just wanted to clarify the first study where I talked about values being irrelevant. What I'm referring to there is that in the experimental treatments, I pair a policy with a principle or a value that does not apply to that policy. So it's not that it's irrelevant to democracy generally. It's just that I have two policies and two principles, and I designed it such that one principle corresponds to a given policy. Then I randomize whether respondents actually get the one that I am saying corresponds to the policy. And yeah, I also want to think more about this question of, are access and integrity actually conflicting principles? I certainly agree that it is possible to have both, and we should be striving to have both. But it seems to be that when designing a system, when going for electoral reform, you are inevitably going to be prioritizing certain democratic values relative to others. It would be impossible to achieve everything we want in democracy all at once, and so that's what I'm looking at. Is I think that there is actually a fair amount of variation in which values within the sphere of democratic values, which ones people prioritize, which ones people would like to see addressed first. So, yep, that's all I have to say now, and thank you again for the great comments.
Okay, great, thanks. Devin, Virginia Gray asked a question. She said, in study 1, you stipulate that to respondents that vote by mail will benefit Democrats. I don't think the research bears this out. In some states, that helps Republicans, in other states, Democrats, and in other states, there's no beneficial effect for either party. So Virginia's question is, does it matter to your experiment whether or not your statements are factually correct?
Yes, that's a great question, because I agree that I'm not at all sure that vote by mail actually benefits Democrats. The reason the experiment is constructed that way is because it seems to me that Republican elites believe that vote by mail benefits Democrats. And so Republican elite opposition, from my perspective, seems to be driven by a belief that it will help Democrats. And so what I'm interested in this experiment is whether that alone is enough to convince Republicans to oppose vote by mail. The fact that elites seem to believe that it helps Democrats. I do think I should specify more clearly in the paper that that's not actually true as far as the literature shows.
Okay, thanks. George Corbell asked, what factor does race and ethnicity play? George didn't address this to either of the authors, or to specify which author, but I think it's a good question for both. So Devin, you want to take a shot at that?
Sure, yeah, I think that's a very interesting question to think about, and it's not something I've directly empirically analyzed in my paper, but I would expect that race and ethnicity are going to have significant effects on the sorts of democratic values that people prioritize, especially given that I'm defining some of my democratic principles as being, almost explicitly racist. So I think that is something that I should look at, and yeah, so I would expect there to be some substantial variation based on race in terms of what people care about in democracy.
Okay, Jesse, did you want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, sure. I think in my setup, it's going to work as in part with the partisan cues. There's some recent work by Baobao Zhang and Devin on filling in the blanks in survey experiments. When you describe something, they're going to fill in like categories. They use countries, but I think in this setting, say we apply this to felon voting in Florida, or voting for felons who have been released from prison, they're going to fill that in under this, at least, that's a democratic cue. Those people are going to tend to vote Democratic, and Republican partisans may not support. That's where I would generally fit that. I don't specifically address that, and I definitely should toss that in. So that's a good thing to think about that.
So thanks. David Holtzman asks, what affects people's decisions to prioritize fairness of elections over partisanship? Let me tack on a question that I was thinking about there that relates to David's question a little bit, as directed to Devin. When I think about the conflict between values and affect, I go back to Snyderman's work on the principal policy paradox, and if I'm reading Snyderman right, he's saying that all of us are affected by kind of affective effects in evaluating policies, but some people, more politically knowledgeable or more politically engaged people, might be able to bring in values as well. And so I was wondering if you're able to, or if you thought about being able to parse out your finding or interact political knowledge or level of political engagement or some variable like that into your findings. But David's question is more general than that, about what affects people's decisions to prioritize fairness of elections over partisanship. So Devin, you want to take a shot?
Yeah, so I haven't actually done that empirical analysis in this study, but a previous study on redistricting where I'm asking a similar question. I find that it actually goes both ways. So for some people who are extremely politically aware, have high levels of political interest and high attachment to their parties, they're actually the most likely people to choose partisanship over fairness. And then there are other people who are also very politically interested, but are not as, for whom partisanship is not as big a part of their social identity. They don't think of themselves primarily as Democrats or as Republicans. And those people are more likely to be thoughtful about fairness and democratic principles and really prioritizing those over partisanship. But in general, I think even people who do not have high levels of political knowledge, political interest, there's kind of a basic desire for fairness, however that is perceived in a certain sense, and something that violates that desire for fairness, like I show in my second study, where it's saying, you know, the politician was caught saying that the policy they support was they supported it for self-interested reasons. Across the board, voters don't particularly like that. So what affects people's decision to prioritize fairness over partisanship? I think partly there is a lot of individual level variation, and partly it is context dependent. If there's a clear fairness choice where most people would agree that one thing is fairer than another thing, people will pick the fair thing. But if once it starts to get a little muddy and one side says one thing's fair, the other side says the other thing's fair, then I think partisanship usually tends to win out.
Partisanship winning out is probably not a wrong answer or more. Jesse, did you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I test that in my framework, and essentially the answer I can get from that is people prioritize fairness over partisanship when they won't lose. That's the pretty explicit answer that my experiments come with. I don't have heterogeneous effects thrown in. If there's, which that was a great thing to think of, Devin, looking at political knowledge. I need to do that on mine and really answer, okay, it's when you don't lose, but who is resisting? I think that's another question that I can answer with the data I have. And if there's any other things like that, any interactions I should look at, by all means, toss in the chat or send me an email. These were way too long surveys. So I have a lot of variables I can toss in and look at. They're not pre-registered, of course, when I do these, but it's good to look at heterogeneous effects anyway. So.
Okay, good. Bob Stein asked Jesse earlier, and I think Jesse may have responded to this on the Q&A function here, but just to get it out for the other audience members, what are the implications of your theory, Jesse, of the adoption of electoral change for explaining the effect of changes have on voter behavior, specifically turnout and voter choice? In seeking to maximize electoral advantage, actors seek to affect two conditions: turnout or suppression of turnout among their supporters / opponents, and electoral victory. Though those two effects seem compatible under the same change in electoral law, is it conceivable that they're not? For example, Democrats adopted early voting in Texas in 1994 in anticipation that it would increase turnout among their base supporters. It didn't, and may have suppressed voter turnout. Why do legislators make rational errors? Do candidates and parties not take up the enacted election law as part of their campaign? Something else going on here. Thanks, Bob. Jesse?
I typed out a bit of an answer there, but just to elaborate. So it didn't make it in this draft of the paper, but it is a pre-registered hypothesis that I don't have enough data to answer right now. But according to what I've pre-registered with the research design here, elites have bad, or they don't uptake information particularly well. They have bad attribution, but voters are worse, is the overall gist of what I'm trying to say here, especially with electoral system reform and changes to election systems. Like kind of the myth that, or not the myth, but the idea that like voter ID really suppresses votes, that hasn't borne particular, or that hasn't been answered to that effect. Or like vote by mail impacts or benefits Democrats. That's the national Republican stance, like we discussed a second ago. That hasn't borne fruit in the actual empirical literature when we analyze these. And yes, it does stick. So there is, when elites are getting the information, perhaps I need to write more on this, they can get it wrong. And then they're going to get their wrong opinions and re-project those onto the general public. And you get this kind of spiral where you get this feedback loop that I talk about where you can get suboptimal outcomes and elites aren't adjusting. Especially in the case of, say, Maine, where Democrats, when you interview legislators, they're like, oh, some people were confused, but it's generally fine. But when you look at my survey data, people were horribly confused about how to fill out a ranked choice ballot and that kind of thing. But they're not getting that information. They're not particularly good at taking it up. So yes, elites do suffer from information deficiencies, just not to the same extent as voters.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to be wrong about that most of the time either. So, Theodore, I just saw that you also responded in writing on to Theodore Landsman's question, but just to get it out there for the rest of the audience. So how does IESC interact with realignment and other larger stories about how American politics changes? Shouldn't elite support for IESC be mediated by how they see their political coalitions as either growing or shrinking?
Yeah, that should dictate the types of reforms or the types of changes that each party takes up. That's not directly addressed as well. And it's more of a post hoc explanation. So take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt. But it is observation equivalent that you would see Republicans right now with the shrinking national coalition of solidly white people, and that demographic is shrinking to try to insulate themselves from that change. And conversely, Democrats with an increasing coalition, primarily driven by an influx of people of color, to expand, at least expand their coalition or expand access to the ballot for their coalition. That's a post hoc explanation. You can take that with a grain of salt, but it would fit with the theory. I'm not saying my theory explains it perfectly.
David Kimball just asked a question. Jesse, I think in your experiment, you had a Harvard professor saying stuff, and he said, might an election expert who is a state or local official have a bigger impact on public opinion than a Harvard professor? David's being humble for the rest of us as academics here, I think. So
the answer to that is it doesn't seem to, no. The answer to that would be no, because when I do the Maine experiment, I don't have the Maine prompt up there. But when I switch it to Maine, I use the same article. I change it to a University of Southern Maine professor. That's actually pretty common. When you look at articles on voting in Maine or any sort of Maine reform, you get Mark Brewer, who is my undergraduate advisor at the University of Maine. There's one professor from Bates who gets quoted a lot, and then another from the University of Southern Maine. I use somebody from the University of Southern Maine, but the person I put is a kind of an aggregate of both of those, or all three of the lead language.
Okay. Since you aren't able to come to Gainesville for this conference, you won't know this, but a thunderstorm just started in Gainesville. And my colleague, Mike McDonald, who did the yeoman's work here with our student Peter LeCarry in putting this conference together, to send me a note that I hope we don't get knocked off because of the thunderstorm here in Gainesville. So I don't see any other questions in the Q&A. So I want to thank Devin and Jesse for their presentations. Leah, great comments. Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it over to Mike to wrap up the conference. So take it away, Mike.
I have just one comment for both the paper presenters, because we can't ask questions and answers, unfortunately, as hosts of this this webinar. So it occurred to me that through a lot of the advocacy work that I've done, where we've run surveys on election reform, and specifically thinking about Maine, that there was a governing problem that was being addressed by ranked choice voting. It was Governor LePage, and the fact that people were splitting their votes, and it was allowing him to win elections, and ranked choice voting was thought to be the solution to get rid of this extremist governor out of Maine. And it's that sort of situation that in our talking with the pollsters who had done work for redistricting reform that I've been involved with for decades now, and in other situations that they would also explain about campaign finance reform or other things, that they're often looking at some pressure point, that there's a scandal or there's a some governance issue that is the leverage point to make the argument for reform. And so it's really not a fairness issue that the arguments will get framed as in sort of the messaging. It's more about cleaning up government. And when there's that groundswell of discontent, there's at least a belief, again, in the public polling that I'd seen previously, that that's the moment where you can get that leverage for reform. So I would encourage both of you to think of it that way too, not just think about this in terms of fairness or partisan advantage, but also some sort of approval or direction of the state or country. Those sorts of measures might also help understand when there's reform, and certainly the reform groups understand this and are using those opportunities for discontent to push forward their reform policies. And they don't usually frame them in fairness issues. They frame them around those sorts of, we're going to make government work better, not we're going to make it more fair. So anyways, I encourage you to think about that. If you want to respond, we've got a few more minutes, so I'll let you respond if you wish.
So the Maine case is interesting because this bears out in the survey data when you leave free response around ranked choice voting. It was, yes, we need to kick out Paul LePage, but that the other half of that was we don't like Paul LePage, and B, he won with a plurality of the vote, and that's not fair. So there's really that interplay going on, and it's really hard to parse those out. My assumption is it's mostly on we want to throw out Paul LePage, and we're justifying that with the fairness argument, because you should have, if it was just the fairness argument, then you should have seen ranked choice voting back when Brennan won in the early 90s, or not Brennan. Brennan won in the 80s, and then King won on another really close race in the 90s against Susan Collins and that kind of thing. So I think it is the partisanship, but it's hard to parse out the argument and justification versus the actual partisanship as well.
That accountability argument, it was very strong with redistricting. So framing it as redistricting reform as taking away self-interest and holding election officials accountable. That's the thing that has over 80% support on, and that's why the reformers have adopted that frame when they're talking about redistricting reform.
Yeah, I guess I agree with Jesse that it seems like and it's very interesting to hear about what the reform groups tend to message. It seems to me that there is an implication in that messaging of that that fairness has somehow been violated with the current system, and that's what has led to the problems in governance. And so, yeah, I do think it's difficult to tease out, but even if the proximate cause of reform tends to be these pressure points, I think it's important to look at the underlying fairness values that people care about that might motivate them to see the failures in governance as possibly caused by some unfairness in the electoral system.
Okay. All right, so I guess that wraps us up. We've managed to do this over 4 days. Certainly our attendance dropped by the end of this 4th day. That's unfortunate because I thought this was one of our more interesting and thoughtful panels, thinking big theory questions about how we get reform. So all of the papers that we had, just to step back for a minute from this panel, where we had excellent papers and discussant, we had just a slew of good papers and very thoughtful discussants and dialogue between the discussants and the presenters. So I'm really pleased with this. Hopefully we don't have to do this next year. Let's hope we're someplace very nice this time of year, all together at the next ESRA conference. But if we might want to carry this forward in the coming months, it seems to me that we can have this discussion through the various listservs that we have. But it does strike me that we could do this. We could do. I would focus it more on maybe just doing 2 panels on one day and spacing that over a couple of weeks rather than try to do it all back to back 1 week. I think we've lost some of our audience by cramming too much into 1 week. But other than that, I think that in terms of orchestrating this, I think we can make this work. So if we wanted to pick up something for filling in for other conferences that are down the road where we may yet still be in this socially distant world, let's consider doing this down the road. Somebody else can also organize it too. Happy to help out, but let other people take the lead as well. So with that, we'll wrap up. And again, thanks to everybody. Thanks to our program committee who helped review all of the proposals. Thanks to our overall host committee who helped with moderating the panels. Thanks to Peter for his help in organizing a lot of the logistics behind the scenes to make this happen. And thanks to our undergraduate research assistants who were really looking forward to doing something with the in-person conference, Sarah and Allie. So again, hopefully down the road we'll be all able to meet in person, and otherwise, have a good 4th of July weekend, and we hopefully we'll be seeing each other again in person real soon. So bye everybody.